Testing mic. All right, mic is good. And here we go. All right. And unmute Nate. Get the music because we don't need any music anymore. All right, welcome to another edition of the Coding Zeal stream brought to you from our downtown office instead of my green screened private office. I am Eric Guzman. Talk to me, Guzman, on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube, wherever you want to find me, and on Dev2. And I am accompanied with Nate Clark today. You want to introduce yourself, Nate?
Sure, I'm Nate.
There we go.
No, yeah. So I've been doing some front end development as well as just full stack in general for a long time, like 10+ years, and picked up quite a few tricks of the trade. And one of them has been accessibility and how to attack that. That is a not as a feature, but as a first class thing that should be in the back of your mind, if not in the forefront of your mind, as you're building out front ends. Yeah, so I've been doing that for a while. That's pretty much it.
Which is great because that is our topic today.
Yeah, yeah. Strange, right?
Yeah, I know. What a coincidence. Yeah, so today's topic is on a web accessibility and keeping, just learning about it, what it is. The acronym, I guess not an acronym, it's like an abbreviation that gets floated around that you might not realize means accessibility. And we'll also be taking a look at an app that our interns have been built. We're going to do a little accessibility audit, see what tools we can use, what do's and don'ts. Whatever we find, we'll see what it is, and we'll learn along the way. So, so what is accessibility slash web accessibility, Nate?
So yeah, that's a common question, and a lot of people think sometimes it's just a switch you turn on, like you just enable it in your app and it magically works. It is not that. It is far from that. Um, so like I boiled it down to my understanding as it being something like if you're familiar with like ADA compliance, that's the Americans Disability Act. It's basically in applying that to a digital realm. So uh, where in the real world you would put things in place to make public services easily accessible, like wheelchair ramps or elevators for multi-tiered dwellings, things like that, aren't necessarily taken care of in the digital space as well. And this was something that was brought up a couple of years ago in a headline. Um, and think this year even Domino's, I think, was getting sued over it not being accessible. Uh, People weren't considering like publicly accessible commerce sites as public services because they were digital. For one reason, they just couldn't combine that thought. I don't know what finally turned the light on for them. Maybe just lawsuits. I don't know. But it's something that needs to be done on every time you're doing an interaction in a web page. It just needs to be in a state where someone using a screen reader or someone that's tabbing through the keyboard can easily navigate without having many hurdles to go through. I worked on a project for a very large sportswear seller, and they were actually in litigation with someone that was, for the same purposes, it wasn't accessible. Their site was very, very poor in that regard. So they brought in an expert. I actually worked alongside of someone that was completely blind to work through those issues and kind of take it to an acceptable level, knowing that they have to take a phased approach because it was a very large e-commerce site. But knowing that and kind of getting that insight from that person, it made it quite apparent where these problems were, and it kind of sharpened my skill set around accessibility in general. So the long of it, shortened down into a quick answer, is that it just needs to be accessible and take away as many hurdles as possible for people that have visual or audio impairments.
Yeah, that's that's really interesting that you worked with someone that was blind, so you had firsthand experience working with someone that had a disability, uh, and trying to solve that problem, because most of us developers don't ever encounter anyone with actually a disability, and so you never
Right.
think about it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And it was great because like I still can't wrap my head around someone that is completely blind that goes into a website and actually uses like has a full online presence. Like they can go in and order a pair of shoes or use Facebook. Like it just blows my mind that just using a screen reader, you can tab through everything and get the feedback that you need and have this mental model in their head of where they're at and they have context, which is hard to do. Imagine, closing your eyes and navigating through those sites. It's something they do on a regular basis, and that can only be possible because of the accessibility that has been taken into account as the applications are being built out.
Yeah, yeah, because that those are the tools on the web, screen readers. Because in person, like you were talking about, there's wheelchair ramps, little compliance. Mostly, it's all physical compliance, accessibility to
Right.
wheelchairs, widening doorways, offering ramps instead of stairs, elevators, braille on
Yeah.
on important things so blind people can actually read. But on the web, I mean, it's all visual.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
instead,
Well,
it's a
until
screen
you
reader.
really take into account that it's not all visual. Like when you pop open your screen reader, like I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to do it or you've ever done it by accident. On my Mac, it's like Command F5, and you bring it up. Don't bring it up here because it will chatter at you.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's crazy as you work with this. Like, okay, now I can actually step through this site, or I can't. Like, it's just a horrible experience. And you can tell right away, like when you go to a landing page for a marketing site or you go to an e-commerce site, whether or not they've thought about it, because typically it's all or nothing. Very few places are they trying and getting in the middle. It's either they know that they have to be doing it from the get go, or they're phasing it in, or they just have not thought about it at all. Um, and you find that typically in like the startups with a small development team. No one has necessarily done any accessibility checks, so it's not thought about, and you end up with this monolith that has basically you have the entire app to go through and make accessible. In the golden days of accessibility, it was, oh, just put an alt tag on every image and you're good. Well, it's not necessarily the thing anymore. But the good thing about that is that there's some built-in tooling or open source tooling that you could easily apply to your dev cycles that will scream at you when you're doing something wrong.
yeah,
There's ESLint tools. There's Lighthouse, which is a tool we may show here. There's also something called React Axe, which is I don't know if it's fully open source, but it is like a almost like a Chrome extension. They also have a built-in, like you could wire it into your React app during dev, and it'll show in the dev tools and show you a lot of nice metrics when you're failing to meet, like for instance, contrasting, like you're seeing here, like the home and location buttons. Those are not. Sorry, these guys. Yeah. So these guys over here, as you can see, the contrast for those very low. They would not pass accessibility guidelines. There has to be I think the number's like I don't know, it's like 3.5 or 4. And that's just a number that tells you how much contrast is between the background and the foreground.
yeah,
So in this case, like the only things to be passing on the page are the title, which probably doesn't have an alt tag on it. It's probably an image, would be my guess, and not an actual font.
let's find out. It is an SVG.
Yeah, so that'll be a screen reader nightmare. Um, I mean, if you put an ARIA label on it, it would be fine. So it's fine to have that. It'll scale nicely and be accessible. But yeah, so There's no way for anyone coming here with a screen reader to know what this website is aside from URL.
Gotcha.
So something that just jumps out, those things.
Yeah, so
Uh,
and then introducing this project. This is the project I mentioned early, right at the beginning of the stream. That this is a La Jolla Playhouse. This is a project that our interns have been developing on. So it's definitely in development. So you won't see a lot of features in it, but there are things to note and take a look at, like Nate was pointing out. So you're talking about the tooling and the ideas. So let's before we dive into the tooling, um, for developers that are just building out a website and stuff like that, what would you recommend are kind of like the rules of thumb to put their mind in the mind of someone that is accessible? Things to know that maybe I should look at this to make sure that it's properly coded or adding the right labels.
I have a list of things. I could give them to you in any order, but the ones that like it's a longer list just because I've been doing it for a while. But the main ones for me, if you can click on it or if you could tab to it, it needs a label. A label that is not the text, or like it can match the text, but it needs to be sentence cased definition of what you're landing on.
Okay.
Uh, if it is, if it has an on-click handler, preferably not a div because divs should not have on-clicks. So if you're going to have an on-click handler on it, an element, make sure that element is a button. And the only caveat to that is anchor tags. Those should also have ARIA labels defining what they are. In rare cases like this, where the link text matches what you would put in the label, this is okay. It's fine. But more often than not, you're going to have like a nice little icon with that text or some complex component DOM inside of there that kind of garbles up what the text would be for the element. So I've found that it's just better to hook in your ARIA labels where you can into those links and those buttons. That's an easy win there. When you're using an anchor tag, you should only use those for when you're changing contextual, like the context of what the focus is of the page. So when you click on home or locations here, that is a contextual change. Those should be links. They should probably, they don't necessarily have to change like the URL or the hash, but you're navigating. So when you think that you're navigating, use an A tag. When you're doing a click of something, it's a button. In both cases, ARIA labels are probably a good idea. It's easier to put an ARIA label on it correctly, and then you change the content of, like, let's say that link later on. You don't have to worry about it displaying or reading to the screen reader different later on. So it's just a good rule of thumb to add those.
Yeah, and I guess that's really good to know, make a note of, because links are one of the most common things on a web page.
Right. Yeah, sure. And sometimes people will make like custom like drop downs or combo boxes or radio buttons and forget about accessibility. So typically those end up being like 8 divs or spans, which should not have on-click handlers on them. But even so, even if you were to do that, adding an on-click doesn't make it selectable or focusable. So it's like if you stick with buttons, you don't have to worry about tab index. You don't have to worry about on-click handlers. Like just in general, if you need to click or tap on something, it needs to be a button. The container of that object needs to be a button.
A button slash, I guess, in the case of a drop down, like an input or something like that.
Yeah, so your input elements have accessibility built into them as long as you're using a native one. So those also, like, there's a whole ball of wax around those. So, like, while those are things that are important to have accessibility, as long as you throw in a label on it, you're generally okay. There's much more you could do to it to make it more accessible, but at least putting that label on there so the person with a screen reader knows what input they're on helps out tremendously.
Gotcha. Good to know.
Yeah. So something like, how do I know that I'm doing the right accessibility? Well, knowing your dev tools here is very important. There's a tab on the right. I'm probably covering it for accessibility. It's in the arrows there. Yeah,
It's
right.
under.
It's
Is
right
there
there.
this one right
It
here?
should be. You don't
Audits.
have an accessibility tab?
Oh, no, this one. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Yeah, that guy.
that one.
I'm like, it's there. Um, what makes me a little sad is that I feel like it should be styles, accessibility. The Chrome developers, if you're
Oh,
listening,
like
move that to the far left.
I can't
That
even
is a
drag
very
it.
important thing to put in place. I don't know that I've ever gone to event listers or DOM breakpoints. Like accessibility should be push it to the front.
Yeah.
But either way, so the accessibility. I was talking about how the links on the left have a label implicitly because of the text inside of the anchor tag. So the way that you can confirm that is by clicking on the linky guy here again. This guy right here.
All right. Click on that.
Yep. And then the ARIA label, it's not specified, but the contents are home. So it's going to read as home.
Okay.
So when in doubt, if you tab to it on the left, and then you go to your element tab, then accessibility, it'll tell you right there how it's going to read on a screen reader.
Let's see. If I click on this guy, it says contents, and then all these I believe are links, so these should be good. So you're making a note though of this logo. That this was going to be an issue. So this is all the SVG content. So here's the SVG. And if we take a look at that, it says absolutely nothing on here.
Right. Which is probably okay because it's not tabbable, but usually that logo in the top left is something you could click on and go home.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not a huge deal, but it is an image on the page that will not be seen by anybody with a visual impairment.
Okay. So I guess thing to know, it's like, okay, so this is okay because it's not a clickable logo. But if you are doing the standard of making your logo clickable to go back home, then we'll need to add in some ARIA label on here to give context to a screen reader that when I'm tabbing over, well, first of all, it should be tabbable if it's clickable, right? And then when I'm tabbing over, should have an ARIA dash label tag on the element that says what it is.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've been to any websites where you tab into the site and it has, it's called a content link. No, there's a special term for it, but it's basically, it pops up in the top left and it says now skip to, it's a skip link. That's what it is. It says skip to content. So if you go to, let me give you a URL.
I think Wikipedia is pretty good at this. Let me turn off my. So if I try to tab into some content.
If you shift tab to go back to the top of the DOM, just keep going. Oh, no, they don't have it.
Let's see.
So if you hit tab, it should pop up.
Okay, so jump to navigation. Oh.
Yeah. So if you hit spacebar enter, I think it's enter. That'll jump you down into the main content of the page. Notice how it doesn't show for someone that, but like you can't see it unless you tab to it.
Yeah.
Like that's there on purpose. So basically, what they're doing is once you tab, it's like, hey, the person is using tabs, so we think they are a keyboard navigating person. Let's show that link as the topmost DOM elements so they can jump right to content. Because 95% of the time, they're not going to want to navigate. They're going to want to jump to the content.
Yeah.
So this one's actually a little backwards. So when your focus is in the content, it's saying, here's a quick link to jump back to the navigation. So in a normal page, when you tab out of the URL, you're going to see a skip link immediately. It says skip to content. And then the converse of that is what you're seing here.
And then you had a website in mind for showing that kind of interaction.
Yeah. It's like WCAG. I've got to find it. Let me see if I can share that with you. Hopefully I'm not going to make myself look silly. If you Google web aim, like instant messenger,
Web,
If you,
web aim.
yeah, that guy. Yep.
All
If
right.
you tab into that, you'll see a skip link pop up.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
And then that takes us down to the different sections.
Yep.
Oh, they even stylize this, so like it does this highlighty
Yeah.
thing.
Yep. And
Oh,
I bet
well,
you anything that the contrast between that background and the foreground is high enough to meet contrast standards.
yeah. So that with that in mind, how can we check whether, let's say, let's go back to the La Jolla Playhouse website. Is there an easy way to check whether this actually meets the contrast standards?
I know that Chrome Canary builds had it. I think if you go to, so if you highlight that element and inspect it,
Not go to it, but just highlight it. There you go.
yes, somewhere in the styles, I believe, if you click on the color, I think that's where it's at. Contrast ratio of 132. So if you down arrow or click the expansion of that, what you need for it, so there's different levels of compliance. Double A is, yep, you're good, and then triple A is absolute awesome. It's very hard to get a color contrast of 7.0 though. Like that's like it's like white and black. It's very very contrasting. So see those lines on the color there? Those are the 4.5 and the 7.0. So if you were to drag or select a color, you'll see those numbers change.
Okay, yeah. So you can see
So
contrast
if you wanted the
ratio.
contrast to meet those standards, you drag it to a color that you like and set your palette to that.
So as long as I'm in between these two lines, I'll be in compliance with double A, and then if I'm
Right.
below,
Right.
triple A.
Yep.
And then since we're updating that style, we can already see that the link contrast is much
Far better.
better.
Yeah. Exactly.
Awesome.
Although I'd stay away from the reds and greens because, as you know, those are well. It's not the reds and greens that you have issues with in your color blindness. Is that correct?
No, not it. Only if they're next to each other. So
Got
red
it.
and greens that are right next to each other. So yes, I am colorblind. I've mentioned this. I don't think I've mentioned this on the Zeal stream before. I've told others, but I am
Cat's
colorblind.
out of the bag.
Oh
Sorry.
God. So I am red green colorblind, and yeah, I have issues with the reds and greens and being close together, and blues, purples, pinks, reds, mostly around the bluish, reddish mix of the color spectrum. Anything that's splashed with red and blue, I have issues with.
Right. Yeah. So, like, if you're setting up a greenfield project, pay special attention to selecting a color palette that is contrasting and hopefully not using the most common colors from the highest color blindness spectrum. So reds and greens are generally ones you want to avoid if you can, even though red is usually bad and green is usually good. There are color substitutes that achieve the same goals. It's more of a, all right, I've realized I've been using this website for 5 minutes. I know that this means good, this means bad. So it's not necessarily like breaking that mindset that red and green have to be part of my site. That's not the case. They just have to be contrasting and consistent.
Okay, good. And if you're not sure, then there is this color picker tool, at least in Chrome, that lets it
Yep.
makes it much easier. Do you have any
Yes.
websites that have like color palette suggestions that you might want to follow in order to make sure that
Usually I Google them,
okay.
but there are sites out there. There's also like a really cool site out there that I'll have to find it and share it with everyone at the end. But it's one that you basically throw a script tag in your page and it'll apply a filter that'll show you what that type of color blindness actually sees for those of us that have full spectrum. So
Oh,
so it'll blend things together so it'll give you a good idea of, okay, these are clearly not differentiating. I need to fix that.
okay.
Like it's just another tool in your bag. Like it's not something I use on a regular basis, but in the event that I'm looking for, like it just dawns on me, I haven't done it in a while, or I have a lot of different colors on a page. that's typically what I'll reach for is something that can quickly show me my issues.
Yeah. I actually installed a color contrast type of tool that I found recommended. So if I enable this, it just does like some standard different color contrast. So
Yep.
I was playing with it as it was recommended as a means to make sure that your color contrasts between different yeah, just to double check between, because I think a lot there are, besides colorblind people, there are people that use high contrast modes in order
Yep.
to see things better that just have
Yep.
difficulty seeing in the first place.
Right. Larger fonts, higher contrast makes it easier to pick up. Yep. Shapes turn into letters with contrast.
That's a good point. I like that. Okay, so yeah, so I guess let's dive into tooling. I kind of
Sure.
talked about this high contrast. I think the plugin's called high
Wait,
contrast.
I do have one more point about this link, just because we're on it, and
Yeah.
I feel like this will bookend it. All right, so on the left we have links, and they're displayed with CSS in uppercase. That is completely okay. But if the text was actually all uppercase, so all capitals, a screen reader oftentimes will read that as an acronym. So when they hover it, it'll say, or when they highlight it, it'll say HOME. And clearly that's not the experience you want to give someone using a screen reader. So while they look pleasing to the eye, it's not always a useful thing to do. So sentence casing tends to be better because there isn't any variation between your screen reader experience and your non-visually impaired experience. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind as well. All caps, bad, unless you're using an acronym. That's and the only time that's appropriate is if the acronym is pertinent to the domain that you're in, like not the URL domain, but the domain in which your site is about. So like if you're on webaim.com or org, if you have WCAG, like that is obviously something that's related to accessibility. So you can abbreviate it there. But if you were to abbreviate WCAG here, it wouldn't have the same domain context. So it's probably better to write that out in your screen reader as web content accessibility guidelines versus WCAG.
Okay. That's actually something I did not know, and good to remember. Don't capitalize everything. Don't be just don't be lazy. You
Yeah, I
could
mean, you can use CSS to do it, to make it whatever case you want. But in general, your translations, your copy should be in sentence cased.
yeah, that is actually really great because I didn't know about that. So now I'll be extremely mindful and not do that and make sure no one else does that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's that. Okay, I love that last tidbit. Thank you for that.
Yep.
All right, so yeah, so let's
Back
go
to
into,
tooling. Yes.
and if you want to, I figured since we're showing this application, I show it to you. This is the first time you actually kind of like seeing it, so let's go through it. It's fairly straightforward application right now. You can submit locations. So I already created a location, but there is a section for forms. So you can go through here and submit a location. And then after you've submitted a location, we can add bookings to a location where we click on this button here and we're given a date, and then you click save and it shows the workshop date. So that's as far as the functionality exists on this application. If we were to try now onto the tooling, so if we wanted to audit this application and see if it is web accessible, what are the tools that we can use to figure that out?
Sure. So one that's built into Chrome DevTools is Lighthouse. That one generally it's still very young, I think, in terms of picking up accessibility issues. But one of the checks that it does is a handful, and they outline the ones that they look for. It's not as deep as, let's say, Axe, the Axe checks, which I'll share in a bit here, but built into Chrome, easy to get to, is Lighthouse. So that's under audits. Yep. So if you were to generate a report on accessibility, probably desktop would be best.
Yeah. And let's do it.
See how good I was or not. So it's not too bad. There are much worse sites out there.
Here we
So
got
there's the
background,
yep,
foreground.
yep. It's another thing too. Like the next one down is language. A lot of people forget that. Yeah, so it's nice. They put in nice links to the element, so it'll go and highlight it inside of the elements page.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
So then it's telling us that background, foreground colors is insufficient, low contrast test, difficult or impossible for many users to read. That's pointing that out. So it's like I guess like you said, it's very minimal. It's very simple
Right.
because it's just telling us, but it's not. I guess well, let's see. Let's see what happens if we click this learn more. Web.
Yeah, it gives you a nice rundown. If you're unfamiliar with that particular one, yeah, it gives a good idea here.
Okay. Let me throw this into the chat in case anyone happens to pop it in. And it gives us a breakdown of what it is. So looks like pointers on font. And then,
Yep.
there's the Chrome color picker that we just talked about.
Yep.
Very cool.
Like you can take some deep dives for sure. But if you're like, I'm kind of surprised at the 73%. That's kind of higher than I expected. So, I mean, that's good for sure. But there are some clear wins we could do here with, a quick sweep, like spend a day doing these and getting familiar with where the mistakes were made. And then you can use that experience throughout the rest of the pages as you build them out.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. So it's telling us about background color, about the color contrast here, adding in a language attribute into our HTML tag.
Yep.
And let's see. It looks like those are the two, and then those three are the only ones that it found. I think.
Well, there's 11 to manually check.
Ooh.
So these are like, it's almost like as you're completing a feature, go through these.
Okay.
Like, did I do that? Did I do this? And so on. So things like tab order, yeah, that's definitely important. Not too many people think about that, but as you tab through it, it's very important to someone using a keyboard only.
Let's see. If we were to tab through this, looks like. Well, now I'm in the. Yeah, let's start here.
Yeah.
And then let's try tabbing. Oh, now I'm in the DevTools section.
Yeah, DevTools kind of steal it, unfortunately.
All right, let's close this real quick and let's try testing this. So okay, so home, location, settings, log out, and then we go here, and jump to here. Now,
Yeah, and that's pretty typical.
I was asking you, is that like seem decent?
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that is harder to do than it is to say, or yeah. So when you're on the left-hand side in that navigation, and you're tabbing to, let's say we want to go back home. When you hit enter here, your focus is supposed to, in an accessible site, move to the first H or header element in the content on the right. So I'm not sure that's happening here. So
Yeah, it's definitely not happening here.
yeah. So that was one of those manually check if this is working things. It's a lot harder than you think, but you can do it. I have done it successfully on many sites.
Oh, I lost it.
Oh, you should be able to go back to it, right?
Yeah, let's generate it. Yeah, you would think if you close it and open it up, especially
I
since
think you have to save it
feels.
or something.
All right. Why is my scroll working? There you go. So if you do the accessibility audit, you should make sure to go through the manual check ones and get familiar with these ones, and if your site adheres to these rules.
Yep. And like a lot of these will be very apparent if you try to keyboard through the page. Like that's how I originally learned how to be accessible to some degree. It's just tabbing through the elements. If I was jumping all over the page or losing like the outline of what input you're on, if you can't find that readily in the page, then you have an accessibility issue when you're using the keyboard to navigate. Um, that's another thing that comes up quite a bit is people are like, "That's annoying. I don't want that outline to be on my inputs when I go to it.
Oh,
Do not remove them. That is there to make your site accessible. It's also there for the people that have no visual impairment to figure out what they're focused on. So don't take it away, even though like your designers are like, that's ugly or it needs adjustment. It's fine to change the colors of it, but it has to be there. Like that's something that should not be removed.
okay, good to know. And yeah, and I
Yes.
guess when you said about changing the color, like on WebAIM, they added like a border, or, there you go, around these parts to add contrast, right? So it's fine to
Yep.
augment, but not.
Well, that border is actually Chrome default. I'm almost certain.
Oh,
So they didn't have to do anything. They just added a background and foreground on focus.
okay. But like adding background, basically you can alter but don't remove.
Yeah, the border. The border is what I'm talking
Yeah.
about specifically.
Okay.
Everything else is cool. And they actually do something neat here. You might see it. So when you go from one to the next, it does a slight animation
Yeah,
to let you know where it's coming from and going to. It's a nice little feature. I've tried to implement that once or twice and failed miserably, but it's nice.
that is super cool because your eyes can kind of sort of follow it.
Yeah, yeah,
That's really cool.
that's the goal. Yep.
And thank you, Mixel, for the follow. And all right. So let's see. We have another page that has inputs in it. Let's see. Let's run the accessibility audit on this now. So when running the accessibility audit, you have to go on every single page and run it. It doesn't do the whole site. It just does it on that one specific page.
Correct. Downside for sure. Actually, I think there's tooling that you could put in your build to navigate through your site to run each one of those pages through a lighthouse cycle and generate a report.
Oh,
I have not done it, but I know that it is definitely possible to do.
well, that's cool. I have to look into that.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet.
All right. So we hit a 62 on this one.
Yeah,
Again, there is the issue with the link color and color,
yeah, you're gonna see some common stuff here. Yeah,
and then here's something new that's a violation. Form elements don't have associated labels.
yes,
So
it's
what
not uncommon.
what is this trying to explain to us?
So there are a couple niceties with the way that accessibility will use the label element. So you see above the input here, you have a label element. Unfortunately, the input is not inside the label, so it doesn't pick up the text of that label. So there are several ways you can make that happen. So in the case here, because the layout is probably tied to two elements in that div, um, we can say that for the input, we add an attribute called aria described by.
See if we can find the JavaScript
Yeah,
for this. That is not it. Add a
you
location.
can find out what component over here on the left in your DevTools if you'd
Oh,
like.
that's right. Thank you for making me realize that.
This looks like a styled label of some sort.
Try to find add location. It looks like is the component in question. add location. There we go. So,
Okay.
and
Yep.
so here's add location. Okay, so add location name.
Yep. So in this case, the full input there, I imagine that boils down to that input. We're going to add a described by attribute to it.
And the input, so describe
ARIA described.
aria
Yep.
dash.
And described by is all lowercase, no dash.
Good to know because you.
Yeah. And then this is going to be an ID that we're going to put on the styled label above it.
Okay. So
So
that's
location name.
location name, and
Yep.
then you say ID location name.
Yep.
All right.
So save that and see this guy. Hopefully refresh. Maybe.
It's transpiling.
Yep.
So the Rails app is running on. I guess we could do hot module reload on. Let's see. Bin pack dev server just to get the hot module reloading going, so we don't have to do a hard refresh. There we go.
Sure. So now, if we go click on that input and then go to its accessibility tab,
The handy dandy accessibility tab.
now we have a description of location name at the very bottom of that guy. Yeah.
Oh, and then
So
describe by the label. Oh, there you go.
so you don't have to change your DOM to get that ARIA label to be representative of what you're actually showing on the screen. But it's always a good practice to have a label and an input. Sometimes the input's inside the label. It all depends on your design needs. But as long as you're linking them, like if the input were inside the label here, you would not have to do the describe by. It would automatically pick up that text.
Okay. Just, I'm not sure how this is going to affect things stylistically, but I
Yeah, we can
am
go.
a little bit curious to see what happens if I try to do that. Throw that in there.
Yep.
My prettier isn't set up, so being a little over. But let's get rid of that
Yep.
and let's refresh. It might just, the UI might be horrible, but oh, it's not horrible. Let's see, inspect. All right, so now our input is inside our label.
Yep.
The styles look fine. And if we scroll down to this input, it says labeled by right there.
Yep. Yep.
So now that,
And like the key takeaway here is this guy. It's going to read that name for that input as that.
okay. So here to there. So it's not explicitly specified, but it's being
Right.
labeled by over from this. So then that's
Right.
what it's going to read out when we hover
Right.
over
And
it.
typically this is how I would try to model my inputs with a label wrapping the input, because you get an added bonus here. When you click on location name, the actual label in the UI, it will put your focus in the input.
And that
And that's
is
true
a
for all
free thing,
inputs.
right, from the browser.
Yep. Yep.
Nice. Very nice.
So
So
that would be my recommended approach if we were to go that route.
yeah, and I think that's an offense on all of these guys. These don't have that describe by.
Right. But if we were to rerun the audit, we should see this guy disappear.
Yeah, the name one.
Yep.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that right now. And yeah, now it's phone number. The
Yep.
first one that comes up.
Yep. So that's another thing. It's more of a usability than accessibility, but sometimes they go together. So like the phone number input, bet you could type letters in there.
Let's go down to that one. Phone number input. Here we go.
Let's change that type to tel, T-E-L.
Tell.
Yep.
All right.
And you may not be able to see this on a desktop, but it automatically knows how to put phone numbers in there now. So if you were to bring it up mobile, it will give you just the keypad for a mobile number, versus before it would give you the full keyboard with the QWERTY keyboard.
Yeah.
Which is a usability, but as well as accessibility. So when I tab into this with a screen reader, it's going to tell me that this input field is a telephone number, and it's going to ask you to put in a telephone number, whereas before it's text input. So it gives you more hints. Even though the label says location phone number, it's going to be telling you that it's asking for an actual phone number, a telephone number.
That's really cool. Okay. Good to, and that's a usability thing. And sometimes I get annoyed when it's not that way. When
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a million little things to think about when it comes to usability and accessibility. But if you try your best and keep things in mind and have nice tooling, it just comes easier.
Yeah.
Over time. It's not
And
this huge like monster that's impossible to overcome, or this mountain that you can't do. Like, you can incrementally learn these things, and especially with the tooling that we have today, it makes it so much easier to just run the tooling. And I mean, you could choose to ignore it, but good developers don't. So do your best. That's all I can say.
yeah. Um, let's see. We're running short on time, so let's see. And time is precious. um,
Yes.
so what are some? So we've covered, you know, kind of like color contrast tools. The Chrome audit for accessibility, some little things that we can tweak on here. What are some other things we could potentially use to make accessibility audits easier for us?
Yes. So I'm going to share a link with you. This will probably change your page.
Go for it.
This is the Axe thing I was telling you about. So this particular guy, it's open source, and it ties into your React app. And I think they're working on like a Vue, Svelte maybe, but I know that React, it's a plugin for React. So when you mount your React app, you add this little Axe guy to it, and what it does is in your console window of the page, it tells you right then and there, like it almost nags you to death if you don't do it. This is an issue with your accessibility. Please go fix it. And I have found, and I've only been using it for about 3 months, but I've found that incremental changes as I'm building out a form, like seeing these things immediately, make them so much easier to catch before they're released into the wild. So this tool is priceless in that sense, that you could just pick it up as you're building out your components versus running an entire site like Lighthouse is doing. So if I were doing a greenfield project, I would certainly do this particular plugin for React, just so I can catch them early on. And it does a lot more verbose job.
Let's see if I can find where to add this into the project. Where is our base? Add. I think we're looking at add a location. Oh,
Right there.
This is our test though.
Oh, that's a test. Yeah, I'm like React DOM. Yeah, no.
Where is it?
Yeah, if you go back to the app.js and right click on it for show references on the actual export. This guy down here. So right click on app. Yep. Say go to reference or find all references. Sorry. And And it should be a short list here.
Yeah, looks like we got this
That guy.
one. Looks like to be the one.
Yep.
And this is a reference.
So that's exported. So right click on that guy.
Find our
Get
references
there.
again. Well, this is giving us.
That's far from helpful. Where's it injecting it to the top?
Yeah, where is this? Now we're just going on. Now we're just deep diving.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll try to figure it out another day. But
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
React X. I believe I do have the Chrome extension installed.
Yes. Same people. I think it's called. It's spelled weird, but it's Deck Systems. That's who came out with that tool. Yeah.
If I were to run this.
Yeah.
And then this would give me an accessibility audit. So there, oh, it's kind of carouseling through the different issues.
Yep.
So insufficient color contrast, the language tag, more elements with the labeling. I like, and then it gives a very detailed description right there, how to fix it. And then we can highlight it. Ooh.
Yeah. Pretty powerful. Worth the investment if you're a product-based company that needs to do this on the regular.
Yeah, it looks like it caught one extra one because form elements seems to be the last one, but ReactX is mentioning about header levels. The header level.
Yeah, the header levels. I think that was a manual check at the Lighthouse audit. But yeah, this one can actually pick them out and say, hey, you're using H3 and there's no H2, or there's no H1. I'm not sure in this case, but yeah. So there's a lot to be done. But I think using something that kind of, as you're building out the components or building out the forms that tell you right then and there in the console that you have issues, makes it incredibly easy to fix at dev time. Make it part of your normal dev cycle. And you learn as you're building these out, like, okay, I'm building out an input. What kind of input is it? It's a telephone, or it's a number, or whatever it might be. Whatever that input is focusing on, that's usually the element you try to make it, and then make sure you have it wrapped in a label. And like a lot of this stuff, you just, as you build out your component library, you can bake it in. So it's not difficult to do, especially with React and prop type validation. You can force a lot of those things to be part of your normal dev cycle.
Yeah. So there are tools that we can integrate in to be a part of our dev cycles to catch it. You mentioned a linter that we could potentially use.
Yes, let me share that with you. And this one is, again, React specific, but they have flavors for Vue.
Put that into the chat too. Go. So this is an ESLint plugin that will catch certain things for us.
So before you even save it, it's going to scream at you with your Prettier or your ESLint plugin, or ESLint. It's going to say, hey, like, back to my simple example of you created an image tag without an alt attribute. It would scream and tell you right then and there.
Yeah. So
that when you do your typical linting checks in your build system or locally, it's going to scream at you before you can even commit that code. So again, bring it to a first-class citizen level of development. This is what all these tools are doing. They're just making it very difficult for you to not be accessible, depending your tooling is correct.
Yeah, I think so. We added this into into this project, but I believe we added it in later. So now those accessibility issues are popping up now. I just ran the linter. So now it's a mix of the linter plus the accessibility issues.
Yeah.
So it's a little hard to parse through. But
like where they have these here, these states, yeah, that's exactly a great place where the abbreviation is not helpful to someone on a screen reader. while it's easy for them to hit tab, go into this input, this drop down, I think it's for, and hit, like for Ohio, they hit O, and it would pop up. And if you didn't have it saying actually Ohio, it would read OH, which is cool, but not exactly helpful. And
Gotcha.
maybe it's a different input, but
Oh, there you
yeah,
go. So for the values, um,
right. So in this case, if you added an ARIA label to it, because this particular select element apparently does not read the text of that option for the screen reader. So you need to add, well, it says down here it's going to read Alabama. So that might be okay. It's interesting, but yeah. Why is it asking you to replace that?
oh, single quotes. Single versus double
Oh, okay.
quotes,
All right.
yeah. But
Okay.
that is something good to bring up is um, it will read whatever. I guess we could check the ARIA, we can check the accessibility item to see what it's actually going to read out, the contents. So, but if your contents are abbreviated, you should add an ARIA label on what that abbreviation is
Correct.
for a screen
Right.
reader.
Yep. Exactly. One last thing that I found very interesting on the project I'm working on is that we have a lot of units of measurement. So we have like an input that says 5, and the label on it is meters. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that when it reads a screen reader reads that input, it's going to read the value of 5, not 5 meters, but 5. So you have to make the label read 5 meters. So that's important to keep track of. Like, okay, what is this unit of measure? Without knowing the like seeing the label, you're not going to know that. You're not going to like the label should be unit of measure or meters, or it can even be abbreviated. But you have to make sure that your ARIA label is the full, like the word meters with the number 5 preceding it.
Yeah. Huh.
It's an interesting thing that I didn't even think about as I started out on the project, and now I've learned that.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great to know.
Yep.
And that's not something you would catch unless you're using a screen reader. I feel,
Right.
yeah, that's so much nuance.
Yes. Very much so.
But yeah, I think we're at time.
Yep.
So, but yeah, thank you, Nate, for being on the stream. This is definitely a large topic to do. I feel like in the future should try to do a stream where we're just working on upgrading the accessibility or making a site accessible, and instead of just
Yes.
talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, this is good. Like, I like if you don't know where or how to find the issues, there's no way that we could like fixing them ahead of time isn't very helpful. You know, it doesn't help people. But if you show how to find the mistakes and how they can be corrected versus just building them out of the box, I think that's a better approach. So yeah, this has been good. I enjoyed this. It was a good time.
Nice. Yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it too, so I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah,
All right, Nate. I won't take up much of your time. You're on a whole different time zone than me, so
sure. No worries.
have a good one, Nate. And
Yep, you too.
yeah,
Have a good one.
yep. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for hanging out. It was definitely a quiet stream today. Let's see here. Looks like the closed caption. I just noticed that the closed captioning might not have been capturing my voice, but it was capturing Nate, which I guess is okay, at least some of it versus not all of it. But thank you everyone for hanging out. If you enjoyed the content and wanted us to dive deeper into accessibility, like I mentioned, actually working on upgrading this application or another application, doing the accessibility audits, and just actually just coding it out and updating it so that it is web accessible. If you want to see content like that, let us know. More than happy to set that up so we can apply what we've just learned from using tooling. So that could be a lot of fun. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, you can always tweet at me at Talk to Me Gooseman. You can tweet at the Coding Zeal account, send me a message on Discord, or reach out to me on Twitch, also on my own private channel. It was a pleasure having Nate on, and hopefully everyone else had a great time listening and learned a couple things or two, and found a couple websites they can use. So thank you everyone for just tuning in, and I will see you next Friday at 2 p.m. and for another edition of the Zeal stream. So until next time, everyone, have a good rest of your weekend, day, week, whatever it is. Until next time, bye, everyone.